We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Tim Price, director at Price Value Partners and the author of Investing Through the Looking Glass, A Rational Guide to Irrational Financial Markets. Tim, thanks for joining me today. It's a pleasure to speak with you. And, we were kind of commenting that we might not be able to find enough to talk about today. And I feel the exhaustion of the news cycle of just trying to keep up with everything. And I'm wondering if you feel the same way.
There is a wonderful remedy for dealing with the news cycle, and it's just to turn it off.
Well, that's, the more that this goes on, the more that I find that is extremely valuable.
I'm trying to think of the guy who did it, but there's an excellent essay floating out there in the ether called Avoidance. And so I forget the author's name, but I came across this. It's probably at least 10 years old now, but making the point that news is to the brain what sugar is to the body. That if you go cold turkey for a while, you'll be amazed at the benefits.
That brings up an interesting point, though, is, you obviously consume a lot of media and a lot of excellent essays and books, as, you've had some very interesting authors on your podcast as well, the State of the Markets podcast. But how do you find things worthy of your time to read or pay attention to?
I think the thing is, it's really just to keep an open mind. So somebody really, really intelligent said a while ago that going back maybe 20, 30 years, you needed I'm butchering the quote, unfortunately, but basically the premise was that 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't a lot of value-added information out there, whereas now there is a complete embarras de richesse of useful stuff. So we've gone from whatever you used to need, now you need a big sieve, now you need a big filter. So it's gone from sort of, famine, if you like, to feast. And the thing that's, we've been living through extraordinary times. So I would date the start of those extraordinary times going back at least to 2016 and the Brexit vote. Because I think the Brexit vote here in the UK was a bigger deal than maybe even it seemed to those of us that cared about it here in the UK. In other words, what it represented was, despite the fact that you had the entire establishment of the UK and the EU coming out on all cylinders fighting against this thing. So you had the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, you had academe, you had all of the mainstream media, you had the city establishment, everything, the BBC, everything, everybody was against it. And despite that, the vote still went ahead, and we voted by a fairly small majority, but by a valid majority to leave the EU. And then, of course, it got sort of stymied by politicians who didn't have any intention of delivering on their promises. Nevertheless, that's when I would say that started to change my view of things in the world, because not least of which was I no longer consume the BBC, because I don't think BBC News can be trusted on anything anymore. Mm-hmm. So we had Brexit in 2016, then shortly after that we had Trump administration 1.0, and that was again a sort of like a game changer. And I think there are a lot of similarities between Brexit and now Trump 2.0, namely, quite a few people have said, that the re-election of Donald Trump shows that the sort of the blue-collar classes, just as they were with Brexit, are willing to vote for short-term pain in the expectation, or at least the hope, that things will get better in the long term. And then, of course, after Trump, we then had COVID and all of the nonsense that's followed in that. But I think all these things point to basically a complete collapse of trust in the establishment per se, notably legacy media. And as a result, to circle back to your original question, what you now have is the media scene. And first you see it easier to find, let's say, non-mainstream voices now, such as, for example, this, the Palisade Gold itself, which I don't think I'm being unkind in saying it's not mainstream media. However you might choose to describe it, it's not of the legacy media type. And so you've had this explosion of alternative media channels. And if you have the time to sort of do the scouring and the research, it's like there is so much quality information and opinion and commentary out there. It's like consuming it's consuming water from a fire hose.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is. And again, I think the point that it's hard to find, information that you can trust. I think it takes as you made the point, it's almost more valuable to be able to filter what you're able to intake rather than just consuming everything. And
absolutely, you've reminded me of what the quote was. So basically, whoever I was citing at the top of the show, 30 years ago, you needed a big funnel because you need to sort of sift the wheat from the chaff, and now you need a big filter because there's so much stuff. You have to be picky in terms of what you select. But this process gets easier if the first thing you do by way of media filtration is to filter out the legacy stuff. So I've long been a critic of, let's say, mainstream, particularly financial journalism, because it becomes quite clear that most of the participants in that market are complete morons. So if you simply literally switch that off and then just go in search of alternative stuff, you will find it. So I think the explosion of things like, I think Twitter or X has certainly helped in that regard. I think Twitter gets a bad rap because, clearly, Twitter's just like human nature. All human nature is there. All human life is there. So if you want to look at kitten videos all day, there's material for you. If you only want to read interesting and hopefully informed stuff from people, then that's there too. But that's the path less traveled. And the great thing about the way Twitter works or X works is that you can piggyback off somebody else. So you can see. So if you, in other words, first find your preferred source, be that whoever it might, Mr. or Mrs. X. And then you can start to look at who they follow, who they subscribe to, and then you can piggyback off that, talent pool, and then build up your own focus. And pretty soon, after a fairly short period of time, you've got most of this is completely free. You've got a huge array of voices, many of which are going to be worth hearing. And then in the aftermath of Twitter, we've then had things like Substack, which has been an absolute godsend for independent and especially long-form commentary. You do not need to read the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or watch CNBC anymore because there's frankly better stuff out there, and most of it costs you absolutely nothing.
I totally agree with you. And again,
so you have to put in the hours to find it, but once you've got that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And because there's so much, there is like a collegiate atmosphere to these like new media sources. So again, it's very easy to piggyback off other people and to say, look, well, someone I really respect follows this guy, so maybe I should follow him too. And then fairly soon, through like 6 degrees of separation, you can put together a network literally of hundreds, if not thousands, of sources. You need never want for paid material again.
This brings up the point, though, that you can search out and find anything that confirms what you already believe in this information space. And mutual guest of ours, Grant Williams, who you've had on recently, made this point. And I think as content creators, we really understand or we're exposed to this point far more often than I think most people are. And that's the point that it is very challenging to be able to hold two competing ideas in your head at the same time. And I think that part of that is human nature to want to only read things that you agree with. However, it's never been more valuable to search out and try to understand, let's say, the other side of what you might not agree with. And,
sure.
Again, is, I think, a big challenge, but a challenge that I think we really need to be able to rise to.
I think the best, and not being overly cynical about it, I think maybe the best tactic is simply to see what the mainstream media is doing, then find someone that has a completely different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about this just in the run up to the recording, and I would imagine at some point we're probably going to get onto the subject of tariffs. And there's something that I came across a while back, which I think is very, very relevant. So there's a book an essay rather, by Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, called The Great Slump of 1930. And in it, there's a passage that I think is hugely relevant to everything we're talking about. And I'll just read you the couple of lines that are most relevant. It says, "But today we've involved ourselves in a colossal muddle, having blundered in the control of a delicate machine, the working of which we do not understand. The result is that our possibilities of wealth may run to waste for a time, perhaps for a long time." Now, that was written in 1930. Wall Street crashed, as everyone knows, in 1929. And then between 1929 and 1932, the Dow Jones fell by 89%. And there's an anecdote from my brother. So I never read economics, and I used to be defensive about that. And now I'm hugely happy that I didn't, because I think I would have just been subject to a lot of basically nonsensical ideas. But my brother, who read economics at Cambridge, he's a bit older than me, he has the following anecdote from his very first tutorial. And he said that basically the Don in question, had his students at his feet, and he was saying, look, the thing you have to appreciate, and he talked about, basically the 1929 crash. And he said after that, in a market event, and then we of course had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, which many people basically blame on perpetuating the depression until the start of the Second World War. And then he had the Don in question said, after the crash, US GDP fell by 10%, then it fell by 10%, then it fell by another 10% in the subsequent 3 years. And unfortunately, the significance of that was lost, as my brother sort of freely admitted, on the students he was with, because they didn't really appreciate the magnitude of that type of collapse, because it's probably never happened before and probably hasn't happened since. But I just find this anecdote really instructive, because to go back to the Keynes quote, we've involved ourselves in a colossal model, having blundered in the control of a delicate machine, the working of which we do not understand. The problem with that is that it treats the economy as an engine, as a machine that is responsive to pulling the right lever or responding to the right button being pressed. That is, for me, and I say this as a student of English, the problem with that is that the metaphor is it's not just imprecise, it's wholly inappropriate. If you believe the economy, as perhaps Trump and his administrative team do believe, if you believe the economy is akin to a machine that responds, straightforwardly to certain instructions, then you're barking up the wrong tree. So the reason I found this so instructive as a sort of learning experience during my career as an asset manager is that at the time I came across that, I then had the good fortune to be mixing in circles with people like Grant Williams, and more particularly people like the so-called Austrian school. And the so-called Austrian economists had a completely different perspective on the market, which is the economy is not a machine. The economy is us. The economy is 7 billion or whatever the world population is, all interacting with each other, all making decisions based on hopes and fears and basically emotionally rather than purely rational. So there's no such thing as Homo economicus. And that, of course, is the big tragedy. So I would say that the reason why we're now having this conversation about the nature of the markets today and the chaos in the markets is because in the 1940s and 50s, certainly after the Second World War, there was a big debate going on as to how the economy should be, quote, managed, unquote. And unfortunately for humanity, the Keynesians won that argument. But Keynesian and perhaps more particularly neo-Keynesianism is nonsense. It simply doesn't work. And the source I would then cite on the back of that is something, again, I had the good fortune to come across probably 25 years ago. And I don't know if you know it, but it's a book called The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker. Very easy read. Again, it's useful for people like me as non-economists because it gives you a sort of potted history of the theory of economic thought. And so this, I think, is the anecdote that tells you everything you need to know about the birth of modern economics. There was a guy called Léon Walras, French guy, who basically failed at every job he ever tried, he ever turned his hand to. In 1858, and this is all narrated in the book, The Origin of Wealth, he says in 1858, he was having basically a long walk with his father, who was presumably despairing that his son was ever going to amount to anything. And Walras Sr. said to Walras Jr., to young Léon, why don't you have a stab at, quote, the creation of a scientific theory of economics? Now, Walras had failed in academia, in engineering, in creative writing, in journalism, in banking. If you fail at journalism, that alone is a huge red flag. I mean, if that isn't a red flag, I don't know what is. And he was rejected twice from France's École Polytechnique due to poor mathematical skills. Anyhow, the point is, Walras Jr. did not give up, rather he flunked again. Before Walras, economics had never even been a mathematical field, and the point Eric Beinhocker makes in The Origin of Wealth is as follows. Walras and his compatriots were convinced that if the equations of differential calculus could capture the motions of planets and atoms in the universe, these same mathematical techniques could also capture the motion of human minds in the economy. So in other words, modern economics was born out of physics envy. The difference being that physics is a proper science and modern economics is bullshit. Mic drop. And I think that's the problem. So you've got so many people basically not least economists on Wall Street, who are basically the entire premise of their thought process is, if you use the Keynesian machine analogy, is incorrect because it doesn't take into account human emotion.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take into account, for example, behavioral economics. If you don't pay any attention to the psychology of things, then you might as well give up, because you will have a model that doesn't reflect real life at all.
Well, I think that's the point that gets missed so often, or is underappreciated, let's say, is this idea that somehow we've given all of this power to this ivory tower that thinks that they are able to micromanage each action and response of that 7 billion people, or whatever it is, and thinks that they either know better or understand it better than how those 7 billion people are going to be able to make those decisions. And I think that, we've seen throughout history that ends up being, a fool's errand. Every time we have these big manipulations or micromanagements of this unbelievably complex system, we end up in a place inevitably that ends up being so much worse off. But I want to go back to your point, Tim, that you mentioned about the population voicing their willingness to accept short-term pain for the possibility of long-term gain. I don't know that many people thought about it that way, because it seems just so much more of a team game now, rather than an actual understanding of, we have to accept some pain in order to fix these imbalances that have been created over time.
I mean, it certainly seems on the face of it to be at odds with the sort of the Adam Smith view of the world, which is that you have everybody acting out of rational self-interest. And you have this magical thing called the invisible hand. And when everybody acts out of rational self-interest, stuff gets done and people get what they want as efficiently as they can. And you don't need external or top-down administration. Whereas I think that the issue being that there's the economy, and then there's the political world. So people talk about geopolitics. And clearly, when you're the USA and you're the president of the USA, you're basically top dog, or you're perceived as being top dog, and you get to throw your weight around. So some of what we're now living through is, like, let's say, old scores being settled, and some of that will be down to political opinions. So what I'm saying is, it's not necessarily a purely economic model anyway. There's so many other things that are infecting the debate. But either way, I think we seem to be living almost like I was talking about this with colleagues earlier. It's a privilege to be just watching what's going on in the world now, let alone interacting with it. These things don't happen necessarily very often. There's a quote from, was it Lenin, who said that decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. Mm-hmm. And it's like there's so much. I'm mixing my metaphors now furiously, but there's a great line from I think it's Apocalypse Now, when Willard says, in Saigon, the bullshit was piling up so high, pretty soon you needed wings to stay above it. And that's what we're faced with on a daily basis. So again, going back to the sort of funnel and filter analogy, it's just like, well, what do I absolutely have to avoid looking at today? Because there's plenty of stuff that's going to be completely irrelevant. Mm-hmm. And this is where things like technical analysis come in. I'm not a technical analyst, but I've got a lot of respect for chartism, for price charts and interpretation thereof. And Paul Rodriguez, who's my co-host on the State of the Markets, is a technical analyst. So that's his primary source of information. It may indeed be his only source of information, because the theory goes that all of the news and the information is already in the price. So you don't need to read screeds of economic text and commentary. You just say, what's the price? What's the price history? What is the price? And then you form an opinion. You don't have to necessarily trade, but you form an opinion on the basis of how the chart looks. Mm-hmm. And that's a revelation if you've been brought up on the idea that there are things called fundamentals that need to be obeyed, and big narratives. The other book I'd cite, or the idea I'd cite, would be Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And the short version I have from that book is that the analogy that I think he makes himself is, so let's say, for the sake of argument, you're a small village or a tiny hamlet or a town, let's say 100 people. that village, that little town, doesn't need any external administration. It can sort itself out. It doesn't need any kind of like infrastructure per se, certainly administrative bureaucratic infrastructure. But that's fine. But then when you're a country in, say, the UK context, say 65 or so million people, you do need infrastructure. You do need a sort of an administration of sorts. And then when things get really tight, and let's say you're potentially going to war, how do you then persuade a young cohort or cohort of your young men, because it will typically be men, to go off and fight and potentially die for that country? And the answer is you tell them stories. You tell them national myths. And these are things that both of us have grown up with, I'm sure, in our different ways. And so he basically sort of, he asked the question, which is ultimately the title of the book. You know, back in our ancient past, there were multiple variations on early man. So there was Homo sapiens, which is us, and then there was Homo habilis, Homo australiensis, multiple others vying for position. Why did we beat out all the others? And his argument is that Homo sapiens won against all the others because we loved telling stories. We had the capacity and facility for appreciating stories and narratives. And that's what made the difference between us and our early competitors. Now, I have no idea whether that can ever be proved, but it's an incredible argument. And it shows, if it is remotely true, it shows the incredible power of story and narrative.
And the idea is you end up passing that information down and those lessons down to successive generations rather than everybody needing to understand the same lesson over and over or learn the same lesson.
And after a while, they're codified in the form of written text. So it's a fascinating argument. But I think the problem is it's also a double-edged sword, because what you can persuade people to do in your own country's defense, you can also, but by the same token, you can persuade people of things that are palpably not true. So in other words, a strong narrative, can also be a dangerous thing as well as an inspirational thing.
Mm-hmm. Well,
when you look at the market through that lens, all of a sudden you start to realize maybe just there's, let's say that the danger's out there, because you think, well, is this just a narrative, or is what I believe absolutely true, or is it just a colorful and attractive story? And this is where it then helps to have, let's say, independent third-party validation or even contradiction, because anything that helps you get towards getting closer to the truth has to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
The truth in this case is being a better understanding of how the world actually works, or what a given instrument should simply cost on an exchange.
But, Tim, this kind of brings us back to this idea of how these cycles end up being repeated. It seems like we're at a new Bretton Woods moment. But if you take the historical lens and, take into consideration something like the fourth turning,
which really seems like Grant is very big on the fourth turning argument. Absolutely.
Well, I totally take your point, but this idea that we can have some rhyming of history that is fairly predictable and end up repeating it over and over, to be able to have this benefit of understanding what has happened before, I think is incredibly crucial at this time, because when we get the choices of the political leadership that we have had over the last let's just say 2 years all over the world, do you think that these quote unquote leaders that we are given the choice of end up being more of a symptom of the system rather than the catalyst or the cause of the problems that we're now facing?
Well, I do seriously wonder whether the concept we currently call democracy is necessarily going to survive this crisis, because it seems to me to be abundantly clear that throughout the West, we have representative democracy. We have, whatever you want to call the uniparty. So in the States, it's Republicans versus Democrats, but it's ultimately the deep state. Here in the UK, we have, conservatives and now a Labour government, but they're the same thing. So there used to be a differentiation between political parties. Now they've all morphed into this sort of soggy centrist mush, which is sort of left leaning, like maybe akin to like cultural Marxism. So what we're currently doing, which is basically our own government, which I would suggest has gone rogue, is now pursuing a mandate for which it has no popular mandate whatsoever, nobody in the UK voted for economic or energy poverty, but that seems to be the way we're going. Germany seems to have gone the same way. So the green lobby has sort of like mutated and metastasized everywhere, it would seem. And so everyone's cheerfully basically destroying or burying mines and gas facilities and all this kind of stuff. And you think, how on earth did this happen? And it's like the kind of the nonsense that happened during COVID, because we had so many fatuous, self-destructive, non-health policies being introduced. And you think, well, if this was purely happening by incompetence, then every so often they'd make a mistake in our favor, but that never happened. So it's much closer to the idea that we're living through like a controlled demolition of everything that we once held dear. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether, so the system can ultimately survive that much longer. So the thing about Brexit, and it has some bearing in relation to what's happened in the States, is a key part of, I think, the reason why so many people voted to leave the EU is because nobody voted in favor of uncontrolled migration. And that is as sensitive an issue here as it was clearly in the States, where you've got people pouring through the borders on both sides, or specifically through the southern border. And not all of those people are people you want in your country to begin with. So, and politicians should not just be allowed to, foist policies on their electorates for which there is no real, popular mandate. So I think this day of reckoning was long overdue in relation to the States. It's fascinating to see how it plays out. But I mean, Trump's completely changed the system. To go back to your point about, the sort of the fourth turning, that is surely the whole tragedy of the human condition, that we never seem to learn from our mistakes. So to use a more workaday example from the sort of my day job, there's this expression I'm sure you've heard, which is, in the context of sort of people and wealth and savings, shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve in 3 generations. So the first generation is the entrepreneur that founds the business and makes the business a success. The second generation inherits it and maybe does a decent job at continuing it. But by the third generation, it's become feckless and flabby and soft and incompetent, and it manages to, basically piss all the money away. And then the cycle starts again and again. So, and that 3 generation thing is not a million miles away from the Strauss-Howe fourth turning idea. That mankind just keeps making the same mistakes. We never seem to be able to get out of the rut.
And that is, I think frustrating once you're able to take that perspective and understand it. But let's dig into some of what you think is actually, let's say, a bit more tangible. Like, do you think that you mentioned this time that we're living through is actually going to be incredibly consequential, and in some ways we're privileged to be in it? Do you think that this is a new Bretton Woods moment, or is Liberation Day, as it was called by Trump, going to go down in history as a complete game changer of the monetary system of the world?
Go back to the comparison or Keynes' point about the machine. I'm sure that there is a specific objective on the part of Trump and Scott Bessent and his cabinet to achieve certain things, and they may not be in a position to fully articulate what they want to achieve because it would be too unpopular. So they maybe have to kind of, cloud it around with things about trade and tariffs and whatnot. But as an investment person, and this has certainly informed our sort of corporate philosophy for easily the last decade, which is, if you accept the argument that the single biggest problem facing investors today, and governments for that matter, is the absolute mountain of debt that probably will never be repaid, can never be repaid, then everything comes back to how do you deal with that? And as we've said in the past, as my colleague Killian Connolly has said, this is no longer a problem because problems can be resolved. This has now become a predicament, and predicaments simply can be dealt with as best as possible, but there's not necessarily a solution to them. So if you accept that that's front and center, the elephant in the room, then everything comes down to how do you deal with that? And we've had, so the current monetary system, as we might call it, basically goes back to 1971 and the Nixon shock, when Nixon severed the link between gold and the dollar. And since that moment, we've had uncontrolled growth in government debt issuance, and that problem has also become manifest in the purchasing power of fiat currencies, because when you suddenly have all currencies in the world go off a hard money regime, then ultimately they're all going to fail. And I think it was Voltaire that said that, fiat currency always returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. So the system's survived with quite a few blips along the way, but that's now 50 plus years. And I think I'm correct in saying, because Killian's actually studied this at the LSE, what we might call monetary system regime change. My understanding is that on average, monetary systems tend to last roughly 30 years or so, roughly 3 decades. So this system is already way into overtime, way into extra time. It's clearly creaking at the seams. I don't think that the whole tariff debate is actually the crowning moment to usher in a new system. I think actually the pivotal event took place under the dying days of the Biden administration, when, they were all dying, I suppose. Every single day was an awful period. But I think it was the moment when, shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the West, brackets the US administration, brackets, decided to levy sanctions on, freeze Russia's foreign reserves. And as a very foresighted friend of mine pointed out at that time, and I'm sure we've discussed this in previous conversations, even at the height of the Second World War, a hot shooting war in which almost every country in the world was involved, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, the so-called central bank for central banks, never dared to touch Nazi Germany's foreign reserves. So they always respected the property rights, even of a combatant regime. Whereas seemingly weeks into the Ukraine conflict, effectively the West just said, no, we're taking your money. And that might have seemed like a good idea at the time, but when you're one of the largest economies in the world, you're a nuclear power, you also have 36 trillion of debt that needs to be, ideally will be repaid or refinanced. When you're dependent on the generosity of foreign governments in large part for that, it probably isn't a good idea to start picking fights with another nuclear power. So basically, at a stroke, the US managed to destroy decades of credibility as a trusted counterparty, and it made every unaligned country, which is now every country, because now I'd say every country in the world is not necessarily aligned with the US, then it made all of those countries seriously rethink whether they wanted to park any of their reserves either in US dollars or in US Treasury bonds. And that and not tariffs was really the game changer. And tariffs is just like the icing on the cake now.
Yeah, that seems like the other, let's say, leg of the stool, or the other tool to destroy any cooperation that was left. And I think it shows in some ways how fragile, but how quickly this system can be upset as well.
I mean, this is the issue with any complex adaptive system, that you start playing around with it. FAFO is the acronym, which I won't dwell on the full title. So it's a family show. Basically, you start tinkering on the edges with complex things, and the principles of chaos theory fairly quickly set in, which is you make one small change, and then a few weeks down the line, you've completely destroyed something by complete accident. And so what we clearly suffered from, what we still suffer from, but this process has become intensified over time since 1971, is that there's a complete lack of trust in the system. So I was mentioning earlier, for example, the whole the history of Brexit and then Trump, and I would include also the whole nature of the EU, which seems to be itself like it's pulled the pin on the grenade, and then jumped on its own grenade. Trying to crack down on free speech is not what people fought for in the last war. So the idea that you can just arbitrarily cancel your opponents because you don't agree with them is so disgusting on every level. And you think, how on earth did we get here? But there are some very dark things happening in supposedly developed democracies that would make your hair curl. So anyhow, so you've got all this stuff going on, but I think what is emerging from this is if you can't trust a system, what you can trust is a system that's lasted, or a product that's lasted for thousands of years, that's never needed to be foisted on people. And that's things like the likes of gold and silver. So I don't think it's any real surprise that gold has been so resilient during this period of complete geopolitical chaos, because it's always been the finest form of money. And I'm sure Bitcoiners or crypto fans would sort of weigh in and say, well, you've now got digital gold, but I'm not as confident that Bitcoin will weather this storm as well as traditional gold has already proven itself to have done.
Yeah, I definitely think that, let's say, that long-term viability, or not even necessarily viability, but transport of value through time has yet to be proven by Bitcoin. But you recently posted an article that kind of talks about these useless ingredients or extra ingredients of economics that result in inflation. And, crypto ends up being one of those. So this idea of multiflation, as it was called, how does that end up being something we need to appreciate going into this time as well?
I think the issue in relation, say, to multiflation is that the big problem that we've all been faced with for some time is the growing financialization of the world. And arguably, this is also something that the tariffs are trying to address, which is, firstly, there's a huge concentration of wealth in very small numbers. So I think the stat I saw earlier today was that 1% of the population of the US owns 50% of the stock market, for example. That sounds like it may well be true. It has the whiff of veracity to me. So you've got extraordinary polarization, extraordinary concentration of wealth, and you've also got an increased financialization in just about everything. So whatever can be traded will be traded. So you can now issue non-fungible tokens, and things that we wouldn't even have imagined 10 years ago can now be traded, and we can issue fart coin and Trump coin and all this kind of nonsense. It's like, stop this ride I want to get off. Where does it end? So I think if you have a culture of extraordinary financialization, wealth will tend to accrue. What we think of as wealth will tend to accrue in a tiny number of hands, and ultimately that's the seedbed for revolution.
Well, it certainly seems that way. And when we look at this time, as you said, being the seedbed, what was the word you used? Seedbed for
revolution.
Revolution. I was going to say change, yeah, but revolution. Again, this time feels, and I think needs to be appreciated as a revolutionary time, yet it is informed by our mutual understanding of history. And trying to, again, I think backing out rather than focusing on every minute detail day by day, backing out again, understanding that there is a proven product, as you put it, that transports value through this time and hopefully gives you some ability to sleep at night, I think is almost underappreciated, but is gaining some exposure day by day. I even read an article yesterday talking about the idea of China needing to devalue the yuan again, and that bringing demand back into the gold market. And you see these signposts along the way as you and I pay attention to this stuff all the time. And maybe you have these details kind of put up in the shelves of your memory only to kind of reemerge at particular times. It's so interesting to be able to have this longer term perspective as we go through and experience something that has happened before.
The day job is, say, one of trying to steward private clients' assets through whatever the market throws at us, whatever the economy and the political machinations throw at us. And ultimately, the articulation of the objective is very, very straightforward, because it's classic Warren Buffett. Rule number one, don't lose money. Rule number two, see rule number one. And then it becomes a question of, again, to cite something from the Buffett strategic armory, stay within your stay within your lane, if you like, stay within your zone of competence. So we were talking about extreme over financialization. So you've got kinds of things can be traded. We've got, you can invest from any decent investment platform now in most countries of the world that have a stock market. You can invest in most currencies. You can invest in the debt issued in those countries or by corporations in those countries. So you've got equity interests, you've got debt, you've got property investments you can make. There are then obviously funds, private equity. There's no shortage of games to play. But I think what it really comes down to is in exactly the same way we were talking about funnels and filters earlier. It comes down to stick to what you think you know, and you can't go. You're probably not going to go that far wrong. But the further you swim away from your core competence, the more likely you are to make huge mistakes. And in a time of extreme geopolitical uncertainty, those mistakes are going to be pretty problematic for everybody. So I'm not suggesting I'm like a Luddite and I don't believe in progress, but I think by the same token, you can probably any investor, and the beauty of private investors over the professionals, the so-called professionals, is that private investors can do whatever they want, maybe possibly their spouse, but they basically don't have to report their performance to anybody. And, and they can be patient. They should be patient, but they have the luxury of being patient in a way that the institutional world doesn't permit. Because everybody that works in the institutional world has to issue daily reporting or weekly reporting or have whatever liquidity your fund or your product offers. And you live and die by basically fairly short-term returns. People spook easily, so your investors spook easily. And bluntly, there are a lot of challenges associated with that. Whereas if you can simply focus on what you think you know, and that might be a principle, say like value investing, which is you consciously try never to overpay for stuff, then that probably helps as well. Or you could take a more of a trading argument, or maybe even marry the two. So we try and marry the two by being value investors, but by also incorporating trend following funds within the proposition to hedges against, unfortunate outcomes. But there's any number of ways of skinning the cat. There are any number of things that we can do. It's then just a function of picking off the shelves the things that you most think are going to add value to your proposition. You can have such a thing as, it's a bit like being a kid in a sweet shop. It is possible that the sweet shop of financial markets is vastly now overstuffed with things that, frankly, are going to do nothing but rot your teeth.
I completely agree, because there's so many distractions, and you mentioned things like fart coin and Trump coin and things like that earlier, and there was a thing going around yesterday that apparently at some point the market was melting down, just ticking down. The S&P and the NASDAQ were just progressively ticking down, and then there was a rumor at some point during the day, that an unsubstantiated rumor on X, that Trump's team was considering removing the tariffs or, suspending them for 90 days. And instantly you saw the market tick back up. And then the White House had to come out with an official statement saying, no, that's not true. And you saw it go right back down. And this hyper-financialization, I think, is extremely visible in that particular example, and the market's reaction to things like that. But on the opposite side of that, you recently penned an article that was called Monty Python and the Holy Grail of Investing, which I read in preparation for today's conversation. And I really enjoyed the comparison and the comedy of Monty Python as a framework to understand what we, typically take for granted or believe as an investing class. But I think the better point of what the article brings up are, let's say, some of these crystal clear rules, like asset allocation, to your point of, staying in your lane or trading what you understand. I think these ideas that, again, value investing is the best way of investing for the long term. As long as you have this understanding of an asset class, as well as the time frame that you're going to be in that type of asset, those are invaluable lessons. And I think that we need to be able to come back to in order to be successful in this time?
I mean, we seem to also be coming back to inexorably to the role of the media, because the media will breathlessly report these 5% down days or 10% down days or whatever we're living through, as if it's like some kind of a disaster. But clearly, if you're a long-term investor, it's actually an opportunity, especially if there are sectors that you thought were cheap before the tariff chaos broke out. And well, if you liked them before, you've got to like them now because they're even cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
There's one of my favorite cheesy old quotes is from I think it's from the Asian crisis of 97, 98. And I seem to remember watching breakfast TV, because of course at the time I didn't know any better, and I didn't know about trying to avoid news. So I was like everybody else, like an idiot. I was watching this stuff, and there was a little Hong Kong lady, and she said, "I don't know what to say. I've been investing since January. I've never seen anything like it." And that encapsulates the whole thing. And I think my understanding is that the Hong Kong Chinese are inveterate gamblers anyway, so they are sort of prone to perhaps overmuch speculation. But it's just the people don't necessarily realize that the financial media is, at the end of the day, media is a 24/7 beast that has a constant requirement for red meat, for clicks and eyeballs and chaos. Those interests do not remotely align with yours as an investor, which is how do you save your money and then keep the money that you've saved and hopefully help it grow. Those are mutually opposed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an absolutely great line from, I think it's a company called, I think it was Tweedy Brown, which is is a US value manager. And a guy came to visit their offices and he said, "You guys are amazing, because normally when I go to a broker's office, I can tell from the mood on the trading floor whether the market's up or whether the market's down. When I come to visit you guys, I can't even tell if the market's open or not." And that's exactly what you want. People don't realize it because they think it should all be buy, sell, and people on 10 phones simultaneously. But I mean, you can have that if you want, in the same way you can go to Las Vegas and gamble everything in a casino if you want. But most people are probably better advised to do something more down to earth with their money. And so the first, if I were to adapt Buffett's rules, I think my rule number 3 would be switch off financial media, or switch off legacy media, full stop. So this is, I mean, as a student of English, I'd say the times we are now in with Twitter, with X, with Substack, this is like the golden age of pamphleteering, where you've got 1,000 voices being heard and happily now not being arbitrarily cancelled by the authorities.
Mm-hmm. Not yet, anyway.
Not yet. I mean, I'm on my 3rd Twitter account. There may well be a 4th.
Yeah, when I look at your Twitter account, some days I'm flabbergasted that it's
still up.
That you are still up for for some of those ideas. But Tim, I've come to call this the age of unaccountability. It's amazing.
I think that's the point that Grant made very, very nicely when we spoke to him a few days ago, which is that's the big problem, that people are getting away, politicians, the corporate class, crony capitalists, getting away with murder, and they're not being remotely held to account for that. And if that doesn't destabilize the society, I don't know what will.
Absolutely. Tim, is there anything else that you think we really need to keep in mind or have a perspective on through this time that you think is extremely valuable?
And nothing springs to mind. I guess the thing for me, as you probably can tell, I love the business of writing anyway. So I'm probably a sort of frustrated journalist, but is the continual re-endorsement of things that make complete sense. And it's in the cut and thrust of the markets on a daily basis. It's often difficult to remember some of these things. So it helps to continuously repeat them oneself and to others. But the fundamental principles that make sense are not complicated ones. They're very, very straightforward, which would tend to suggest that the single biggest problem with investing is one's own psychology. It's keeping command of your emotions to such an extent that you can be, for want of a better phrase, stoic when you're in a market like the chaos that we're currently experiencing. And stoicism is one of the most difficult things for humans to practice successfully. So anything that helps that process, even if it's just by the repetition of, constant repetition of valid approaches, that all helps. That all helps.
Mm-hmm.
So I just like to refamiliarize myself with some of these basic principles, and hopefully that may assist others as well. And Buffett's right-hand man, the late lamented Charlie Munger, brought it down to absolute, brass tacks when he said, people respond to incentives. So show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. That's all you need to know.
Absolutely. I've come back to that many times as well. It's always a real pleasure to speak with you with your understanding and grasp on not only the English language, but of history as well. For anybody that would like to be entertained or maybe wowed by your...
Or disgusted, perhaps.
that too. By your X profile at Tim Price 1969. Excellent podcast as well, the State of the Markets podcast, and then your articles and more about you guys can all be found at pricevaluepartners.com. Tim, always a pleasure and really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much. Our pleasure too.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.